Deep in a ravine, under a multi-meter layer of heavy, compacted spring snow, the rescuers found the last bodies. And the horror they felt was not related to the mere sight of death. Ludmila Dubinina had her ribs broken on both sides, yet her body had not a single bruise. Semyon Zolotaryov's chest was crushed inward, as if a car had driven over him. And most terrifyingly, both were missing their eyeballs. Science will say it has found an explanation for this. But if the answer has been found, why does it only make your blood run colder? A winter night, an endless, crushing silence of a snow-covered wasteland. An archival, grainy, black-and-white photograph. 9 young, smiling faces, full of life and anticipation. Students and engineers, frozen in time, moments before their final journey. The shot cuts abruptly to a modern, crisp image of the exact same place, the northern Urals, the slope of Kolotsiakol. Wind rips dust like snow from silent stones. For most stories, this place is a synonym for an unsolvable enigma. But today, we will begin with the end, with the answer. In 2024, after decades of speculation, science declared that it had closed the case of the Dyatlov group. The answer turned out to be brutally simple and terrifyingly realistic. But if the answer has been found, why does the chilling feeling that something is wrong only intensify? February 1959. A group of 9 experienced ski hikers, led by Igor Dyatlov, fails to make contact at their scheduled time. A search operation begins. What the rescuers find will give birth to decades of fear and speculation. A tent, cut open from the inside. A chain of barefoot tracks leading down the slope. And the bodies. Scattered over a large distance, some almost undressed despite the lethal frost. Some showed signs of death by hypothermia. Others had horrific, life-incompatible injuries, crushed skulls, broken ribs. And yet there were no external wounds, no signs of a struggle. The official conclusion of the Soviet authorities was vague and unsatisfying. A compelling natural force which the tourists were unable to overcome. The case was closed and classified for years, leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled by the wildest theories, from an attack by a snowman and secret military tests to contact with an alien intelligence. Years passed. The story of the Dyatlov group became a global phenomenon, the benchmark for an unsolved mystery. Until Swiss scientists took on the case. Their work, published in leading scientific journals and supported by data from expeditions in 2021, 2022, and 2024, offered the world not mysticism, but cold, ruthless physics. To understand what happened that night, one must forget about monsters and conspiracies. One must look at the mountain itself. Kolotsiakol, despite its infamous reputation, is not extremely steep or prone to avalanches in the classic sense. That is precisely why Dyatlov, an experienced leader, considered it possible to set up a tent on its slope. It was not recklessness. It was a calculated decision based on knowledge. But he failed to account for one specific and treacherous factor, characteristic of this very region, a factor that scientists have named the delayed slab avalanche. The investigation, led by Professors Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzrin, began not in the KGB archives, but in laboratories and with computer models. They recreated the exact conditions of that night, a slope angle of less than 30 degrees, which is considered safe, a strong wind that blew snow onto the leeward slope where the tent stood, and most importantly, a peculiar structure of the snowpack. In the days before the Dyatlov group's arrival, there had been a thaw, followed by a sharp cold snap and snowfall. This created the perfect conditions for a deadly trap. On top lay a dense layer of snow compacted by the wind, a so-called snow slab, and beneath it was a fragile, unstable layer of depth hoar. The hikers, preparing for the night, did what is always done in such conditions. They flattened an area for the tent by cutting into the snow slope. With this action, without knowing it, they signed their own death warrant. They created an artificial cut in the snow slab, compromising its integrity. This was the trigger, but the shot was not fired immediately. This is the treachery of the delayed avalanche. The load from the freshly fallen snow and the katabatic wind, which that night reached speeds of up to 30 meters per second, slowly, hour by hour, increased the stress at this point. The inner world of the tent, cramped, the warmth of bodies, the smell of woolen socks and frozen skin, the quiet hum of the stove, now extinguished, laughter fading into slumber. Someone turns in their sleep, muttering something intelligible. Outside, the wind howls, but it's a familiar, lulling sound. They feel safe in their small, man-made world in the middle of an icy wasteland. The hope for tomorrow, for a successful completion of the route, for the return home, warms them from within. Computer modeling conducted by the Swiss team showed that the critical point was reached approximately 9 to 13 hours after the tent was set up. This perfectly coincides with the time when the hikers had already gone to sleep. At night, in complete darkness and silence, a blow struck the tent. It was not a gigantic avalanche sweeping away everything in its path, as seen in movies. It was the shift of a relatively small but incredibly heavy snow slab, about 5 meters long, weighing several hundred, perhaps even thousands of kilograms. It did not bury them, it crushed them. Imagine yourself in their place, deep sleep in the cramped space of the tent, and suddenly a deafening crack and a crushing blow from above, impenetrable darkness, the inability to breathe under the weight of the snow, the screams of comrades, the crunch of your own bones. Panic. Pure animal panic. In such conditions, a person does not reason, they act on instinct. The only way to salvation is out. It doesn't matter how. The knives that the hikers always kept at hand were put to use. They cut the tent not because of an external threat, but to escape the snowy grave it had become. Having gotten outside, they faced a new reality. A hurricane-force wind, a temperature below minus 25 degrees Celsius, and complete darkness. They were half-dressed, having escaped the tent and whatever they were sleeping in. Some were seriously injured. The modeling showed that the impact of the slab on the sleeping people in different parts of the tent fully explains the nature of the injuries recorded on Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov. Multiple rib fractures sustained as a result of a slow, compressive force. This is not what a blow from a rock or a fist leaves behind, but it is exactly what happens when a huge mass of snow presses down on the chest. Thibaut Brignol's fractured skull was the result of the same thing. They did not receive these injuries outside, they received them while still in the tent. Their subsequent actions, which for decades seemed irrational, gain a tragic logic from this perspective. They retreated down the slope. Why? Because to remain on an open, wind-swept slope where an avalanche has just occurred is certain death. The instinct of any hiker is to descend into the forest line to shelter from the wind and build a fire. They moved together, in a line, helping their injured comrades. The tracks that so puzzled the rescuers led precisely there. At the edge of the forest, under a large cedar tree, they made a desperate attempt to survive. They built a fire. The marks on the cedar, which conspiracy theorists interpreted as an attempt to climb the tree to escape an unknown enemy, were merely an attempt to break off branches for the fire. Two of them, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, froze to death here first. They were the most poorly dressed. The others, realizing that a small fire would not save them, made a final, heroic decision. They began to dig a shelter in the deep snow, a snow cave. This is a standard survival practice in winter conditions. In this shelter, in a ravine, the last 4 bodies were found. The bodies with the most severe injuries. They did not die from the cold, they died from the wounds received back in the tent. Their comrades tried to save them until the very end, even giving them their own clothing. When the rescuers found them, the scene looked gruesome and inexplicable. But if you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, what emerges is not a mystical thriller, but a tragedy of human courage and a desperate but lost fight against the elements. The missing tongue of Ludmila Dubinina that gave rise to the most monstrous rumors? Forensic experts concluded back in 1959 that it was the result of post-mortem decomposition in a wet environment. Their shelter in the ravine was flooded by a stream in the spring. The strange orange color of the skin? The result of frostbite and subsequent biochemical processes in bodies that had lain in the snow for several months. Science, it seems, has found an explanation for everything. A cold, rational, soulless one. It leaves no room for monsters. It only leaves room for snow, wind, and a fatal chain of coincidences. The case is closed. The story is over. Or is it? The scientific theory is elegant, logical, and supported by calculations. It is convenient. It closes a terrible page of history and classifies it as an unfortunate accident. But upon closer inspection, thin, web-like cracks begin to appear in this monolithic structure of evidence. Cracks that neither computer modeling nor the laws of physics can explain. And the first, deepest crack is the testimony of witnesses. Not just the search party members, but also other tourist groups and even the local Mansi people. Testimonies that were hastily removed from the case file in 1959. Testimonies of strange, fiery spheres observed in the sky over the northern Urals during the nights of the group's demise. These were not isolated reports. Dozens of people within a radius of hundreds of kilometers described the same thing: bright, fast-moving, or hovering luminous objects. What were they? Meteors? Atmospheric phenomena? Or something else? And here emerges a second, even more disturbing fact: radiation. An examination conducted in May 1959 showed the presence of elevated levels of radioactive substances on the clothes of several tourists, specifically on a sweater found on one of the bodies in the ravine. Where could radiation have come from in the remote taiga, thousands of kilometers from the nearest nuclear facilities? The avalanche theory provides no answer to this question. It simply ignores it. And yet it was this fact that led the chief investigator of the case, Lev Ivanov, to state many years after his retirement that he was certain the cause of the tourists' deaths were those very fiery spheres. Radiation and unidentified flying objects, these are the two elements that completely change the rules of the game. They transform a tragic accident into something entirely different, a potential crime. And this crime, like any other, must have motives and perpetrators. At the height of the Cold War, in an isolated region of the Ural Mountains, there could only be one candidate: the Soviet military-industrial complex. Let's consider this version not as a conspiratorial nonsense, but as a logical proposition. The Ivdel area, from where the Dyatlov group began their journey, was historically part of the vast Gulag system. It was a closed, strictly controlled territory. There were no casual wanderers here. Could a group of tourists, however experienced, have accidentally strayed into a secret test site? Entirely possible. In the Soviet Union of that time, maps often contained deliberate distortions to mislead foreign intelligence. What if the fiery spheres were not UFOs, but failed tests of new rocket technology? Imagine that one of these rockets, or its booster stage, crashes in the area of Kolatsiako. The heptal fuel used in these rockets is extremely toxic and, upon combustion, can cause the very orange skin tone that was recorded on the deceased. It could also have been the source of the radioactive contamination on their clothing. In this version of events, the tourists become not victims of the elements, but unwanted witnesses to a state secret. A deafening explosion or the shock wave from falling debris could have inflicted the same terrible internal injuries that do not fit the explanation of the slow pressure of snow. This also explains the panic flight and the unwillingness to return to the tent, which could have been contaminated by fuel components. And then the logic of a cover-up comes into play. A special cleanup crew sent to the crash site discovers not only wreckage, but also surviving, yet doomed witnesses. In conditions of absolute secrecy, their fate is sealed. Death by hypothermia becomes a convenient cover story. The bodies are moved to create the appearance of a chaotic escape from an avalanche. The case is quickly closed and classified, and key pieces of evidence, such as Yuri Krivonishenko's first camera, which was rumored to be on his chest, vanish without a trace from the case files. In this version of events, the horror does not come from nature. It has a human face. The face of a state machine for which 9 lives are merely an unfortunate obstacle in achieving its global objectives. But even this nearly perfect theory has its flaws. Why was no debris ever found? Why were the injuries of such a specific, compressive nature rather than shrapnel-like as in an explosion? And the main question, if this was a cleanup operation, why was it conducted so sloppily? Why were tracks, bodies, and a tent left behind? Professionals work cleanly. What happened at Dyatlov Pass was not clean work, it was chaos. And perhaps both the military and the tourists were merely pawns in a game whose rules were set by someone or something else entirely. To find the last piece of this mosaic, we must discard modern logic. Forget physics and geopolitics. We need to return to the very beginning, to the name. The indigenous peoples of this area, the Mansi, call this mountain Kholat Syako. In their language, this means mountain of the dead, not dangerous mountain, not cold mountain, specifically mountain of the dead. According to one legend, in time immemorial, 9 Mansi hunters perished on this very slope under mysterious circumstances. Since then, the place has been considered cursed, forbidden, a place where one must not go, especially not in a group of 9. Igor Dyatlov's group consisted of 10 people, but one of them, Yuri Yudin, left the route early due to illness. Exactly 9 tourists ascended the mountain on that fateful night. A coincidence? For a skeptic, yes. For one who believes in the echoes of the past, a sinister omen. What if the force that dwells there uses no claws or weapons? What if its weapon is the human mind itself? It can induce a baseless, irrational, all-consuming terror, the very panic terror that forces experienced hikers in the middle of the night to cut open their own shelter and run barefoot to certain death. In this version, the fiery spheres are not rockets. They are a manifestation of this force, a warning, or its true incomprehensible form. Then the avalanche ceases to be a coincidence. It becomes a tool. The mountain, awakened and enraged by the intrusion, uses the elements as a weapon. First, it drives them from the tent with a mental assault, and then it delivers the physical blow with snow and wind, the perfect storm. Not just a confluence of events, but a directed act, a tragedy where science was merely the weapon, human secrecy was the distraction, and the true cause was an ancient, unknowable horror that had been waiting for its next victims. And it got them. So, we are left with 3 layers of the same tragedy. The scientific, a story of a fatal coincidence. The conspiratorial, a story of human cruelty. And the mystical, a story of forces that lie beyond our understanding. Which of these versions is the truth? Perhaps all 3 at once. Perhaps the mystery of Dyatlov Pass is not an equation with a single solution. It is a point where science, human agency, and primordial horror converged, giving birth to a phenomenon that we may never fully comprehend. And when we look at these faded photographs of smiling faces, we are not just seeing victims of an accident or a conspiracy. We are looking into the eyes of people who peered beyond the edge of the known world, and what they saw there remained with them forever, in the eternal silence of the mountain of the dead. Now, you know this story, and this knowledge, like any strange signal, leaves its mark. Perhaps you felt the same cold. Perhaps you saw something that others missed. Our archive is not just about facts, but also feelings. Share your thoughts below. We read everything. To avoid missing the next signal from the darkness, stay on this frequency. Subscribe. End of communication.